Hello everyone. I am presenting my talk today, 11 Herbs and Spices, and in honor of that I've made this ridiculous image on the right. I hope you enjoy that. I put myself on a KFC bucket. I am Professor Kevin Solez. I'm visiting assistant professor of classics at Memorial University of Newfoundland and director of the research group for the comparative study of feasting. So I want to talk to you about a typical spice and herb combinations in cuisines that you are very familiar with, and introduce the sort of the one main point, which is that all of them have healthful impacts on the human body, and exactly how typical spice combinations in cuisine came to have that medicinal nature is not very clear, but that they do is clear, and so I want to demonstrate that to you today. So I thought I would show you some theoretical background with what I was trying to do with the research group for the comparative study of feasting, which I founded in 2015, and we've had all sorts of different meetings, events for students, and we've presented research around the world. With respect to the topic today, the purview of the research group also studies cuisine from a public health perspective, and I'm directing you to the bolded text there. As medical research has shown that certain foods, spices, and aromatics and their combinations associated with feasts on a variety of sacred calendars contribute to the healthy functioning of many systems of the human body, from cardiovascular health to mental health. And so I'm presenting data within that scope today. So there are three groups of herbs and spices that I want to discuss today. The first is something you're very familiar with. It's called pumpkin spice in our sort of jargon. It's basically a slang term, but this is a traditional blend for Northern European holiday sweets. We call it pumpkin spice. It contains cinnamon, cloves, ginger, allspice, and nutmeg. Interesting thing about pumpkin spice is that it was once the typical spice mix for sweet and savory cuisine. And as the medieval period gave way to the modern period, with respect to savory cuisine, herbs took over from these spices. And so they were no longer favored as seasonings for meat and vegetables in savory preparations, but they remained in sweet preparations, and that's where we know them. So I'm going to talk about pumpkin spice. I'm going to talk about the traditional blend for Northern European holiday savory dishes. That is not the medieval blend, but this is the early modern blend, sort of 1700s in origin. And this we know by the byword POULTRY seasoning. And this contains parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, as in the Simon and Garfunkel song, and oregano. And then the third group that I want to talk to you about today are aromatics, things that are burned in ceremonies and that sort of in religious contexts. And they, like the spice and herb mixtures I'm talking about, have healthful impacts that I would like to elaborate on here. So the talk today has one main point, which is that these mixtures, these typical ingredients in cuisine and rituals, have medicinal properties. One wonders just precisely how cuisines really around the world, many cuisines, came to sort of combine these ingredients and use them over and over again in many dishes. But some sort of process of trial and error or knowledge that these herbs help with health and would be good if we consumed more of them is probably behind this. And so we've got cuisine, what appears to be cuisine on the surface, functioning as medicine. And that connects to a kind of slogan that you hear today, food is primary medicine. And we don't often get foods prescribed to aid our medical conditions, but sometimes we do. In Greco-Roman antiquity, food is the typical way to deal with ailments. So if you go to the corpus of ancient medical authors, most of what's going on there, most of what they prescribe to help their patients is basically food preparations. Consume this, don't consume that, make a special preparation of X, Y, and Z, cook it a little bit differently than you ordinarily do, and this is supposed to heal the patient. So we don't know exactly how the properties were initially recognized, but there is no doubt that pumpkin spice and poultry seasoning are good for human health in general, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be good for your individual health. That is, of course, an individual matter. But in sort of for the normative human body, these things have healthful impacts. And so what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about the history and where these combinations came from and how they were used. And then I'm going to look at some literature that you are more familiar with, which is scientific literature about these herbs and the oils and molecules that they contain. So we start with pumpkin spice. I don't like calling it pumpkin spice, but if I say pumpkin spice, you know exactly what I'm talking about. No mystery there. So in Canadian cuisine, this combination is Northern European in origin, but it is not Northern European in origin. It required the influence of Arab cuisine, especially for cinnamon and cloves. So as part of the medieval development when there were more Arabic-speaking people in Southern Europe. So they brought their cuisine with them in the early medieval period, and so European cuisine became influenced by this. And so especially in the area of cinnamon and cloves. But so this combination that we know of as pumpkin spice is really thousands of years old in Eurasia. And in that domain, it comes from West Asia. So it is at home in West Asia, in Turkey, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Arabia, this area. So as I mentioned, this spice combination was in the medieval period in Europe typical of sweet and savory cuisine. And then there was a development that happened at different times in different countries. The author of this book, Everyone Eats, which provides very good information about the history of food and cuisine. This is Anderson. Everyone Eats by Anderson. He talks about the 17th century, the 17th and 18th century in France as being the time when pumpkin spice spices, as applied to meats and vegetables, fell out of favor and were replaced by herbs. And this happened also in England and other places. So you can imagine a medieval European cuisine that had these typical pumpkin spice spices applied to roasted meats and vegetables and all this sort of thing. And then that fell out of favor. But we are very familiar with this spice combination because it survived in the preparation of sweets. And so, you know, you don't have to look very far to find the same combination of spices, such as apple pie, mincemeat pie, gingerbread cookies, you know, gingerbreads, mulled ale and wine, of course, pumpkin pie. Now, pumpkin pie itself requires a North American ingredient, which is the pumpkin. So this was not typical of medieval or early modern European cooking, but you know, we associate it with pumpkin in Canada because we eat pumpkin pie and are familiar with the with this combination of spices in pumpkin pie. Okay, so that's a little bit of historical, cultural background on this combination. And just to illustrate the points that I'm trying to drive home here, here is some scientific literature involving pumpkin spice spices. And you'll find an enormous amount of research on nutmeg and nutmeg in health. Here, you know, you have a couple articles on nutmeg and one on ginger and nutmeg. But the research on cinnamon, cloves, allspice is similar to this. There just isn't quite as much of it. And if I've piqued your curiosity, I invite you to go find it. And hopefully you'll find some of this useful in your own work. And so, you know, some of this research is basically about ethnomedicine, just traditional medicines and investigations of traditional medicines to see if they can be demonstrated to be effective. Some of it is sort of further research on already identified antioxidants or antimicrobial properties of these spices. Okay, well, that's it for pumpkin spice. And let's move on to the humble poultry spice, poultry seasoning. So in Canadian cuisine, this combination comes to us from England, where in that period in the 1800s, a little bit later than in France, the typical medieval spice combination, which now you know is pumpkin spice, fell out of favor. And it was replaced by herbs for savory dishes. And so the way that we use this parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, and oregano mix in Canada is in the English tradition. These typical uses that we're familiar with, they date from the transition from the medieval to the early modern. Spices gave way to herbs. These were the preferred herbs for savory dishes. And food across Northern Europe at this time, like between the 1700s to the 1900s, became simpler as a matter of taste, which is an interesting phenomenon. So the medieval spice combination, pumpkin spice, led to dishes, you know, incredibly flavorful, spicy dishes, and that fell out of favor for more lightly seasoned dishes, which is very typical of our cuisine still today. So poultry seasoning is applied to roasted meats, to roasted and fried vegetables. You can find it in more context than that, but that is basically what it is. I mean, you could throw those herbs in as you boiled vegetables or something and produce a nice effect. So we are very familiar with this. It is typically associated with holiday cuisine, and that is generally interesting. But it's sort of like these are traditional preparations that have been sort of configured as holiday foods, and that's not how these uses of the spices and the herbs originated. They were the typical combination used every day all the time. And now, because they are traditional, we sort of deploy them in holiday contexts, which are meant in some sense to connect us to the past. So we associate them with holiday foods, but many of us also cook meat with these seasonings or cook vegetables with these seasonings on a regular basis. I guess when I initially became interested in this area of research, sort of typical, absolutely well-known, everyday herbs and spices and their healthful benefits in the human body, I was interested in their association with festivals, with holidays, typically winter holidays, from the fall and the winter, because this is a time when people are more susceptible to some pathogens, right? The cold brings about a greater susceptibility to certain kinds of diseases, and some of those diseases are things that these herbs and spices work against. So I was, initially interested in that the seasonal association of these substances with, in our cuisine, but I no longer think that that's particularly significant because these weren't special festive foods in origin. They were the typical spice or herb combinations for everyday use all year round. So it's sort of it seems less significant that we recognize them as something we consume, especially in the winter. So here is some literature about poultry seasoning, or the typical herbs in poultry seasoning. So you'll see sage here, and we will discuss sage later. There is a lot of research on the antibacterial, antimicrobial uses of sage, or the powers of sage in that way. And so, if you got interested in that and went looking for that, you would find a lot of evidence of scientific studies of sage, the dietary sage and its impacts on the body. And you'll see in that second article there, that's a study of both oregano and sage. And the final study features thyme, which is very well known as something that can assist you with typical symptoms of a cold. It soothes the respiratory tract to eat thyme, and you probably are familiar with that if you've ever eaten a Ricola candy to soothe a sore throat or something like that. Ricola is full of thyme and other typical herbs from poultry seasoning. Okay, so there's some literature if you want to go investigate this material. It is there for you, and you should probably find some interesting things, and maybe you'll throw some more sage in your food if you're feeling a little under the weather. So another area of special interest to me is the area of aromatics. These are substances I associate it with feasting and food, because these are substances that are burned and typically in a religious or ceremonial context. So, there's a close association between these substances that are aromatized or that are used in fumigation and these other herbs and spices that are used in food. Like, I mean, there's a close temporal association often with when you'll experience the aroma of one of these things being burned and when you might consume herbs and spices in food. So let's start with sage. It would be difficult to overestimate the significance of sage in North American culture. Sage has been used for fumigation, what you are probably familiar with in the term smudging, for thousands of years in North America. It is at the heart of indigenous ceremonies in North America, one of the very important ceremonial religious substances in a variety of indigenous cultures. Now, a substance that has a very similar status to sage, but in Eurasia, is frankincense. So frankincense is prepared from a resin from a tree, and it's made into a hard substance that can be burned as incense. And it's been used in fumigation for thousands of years in Eurasia. It's used for fumigation here in North America in the sense that religious traditions from Eurasia are now practiced here, including Christianity, Judaism, which traditionally deploy frankincense in certain religious contexts. You'll see priests swinging censers, which are these ceremonial incense burners, and there's a bunch of smoke puffing out of them. That is frankincense smoke, so you'll see it in religious ceremonies. You may have seen it or smelt it before and not known it was frankincense. So again, it's a substance used as an aromatic, used for fumigation, and both of these substances that I want to talk about, they are typically embedded in religious or ceremonial contexts. Now, we've already discussed sage, so dietary sage and surface applications of sage, say sage preparations that are applied to the skin, have been tested and are sort of part of ethnomedicine today, and there's research going on about it. Sage as an aromatic or as fumigation has been shown, but these studies are harder to find, to reduce the bacterial load in the air in a space that's been smudged. That's an interesting phenomenon, I would say, but I think that the research on that, studying sage smoke and its antimicrobial properties, I would say that that's quite new research. So in what follows, I'm going to show you studies of frankincense. So let's have a look here. So some scholars are testing frankincense compounds and their impacts on infection, inflammation, and oral health. Others are studying it, frankincense essential oil, as a supportive therapy for cancer-related fatigue. That's interesting. That seems like a mental health application of frankincense, although I'm not sure if what they're claiming is that it has a physical or rather a mood impact on the patient. I'm interested to find out more about that. And then we've got a investigation of traditional applications of frankincense and sort of investigating the efficacy in the treatment of serious illness. So I hope I've given you plenty of food for thought today and given you a little bit of sort of historical, cultural background from other contexts that aren't our own that can supplement some of the things that you're already working on and thinking about. And so it remains for me to thank you very much for your attention today. I really enjoyed talking to you about this.